I'm excited for this morning's sermon in one sense, but I know that it'll be a challenge in another sense. It is, without doubt, one of the most difficult topics you can talk about. Death. And I've entitled the sermon this morning, What is Death? What is Death? As we make our way through John 11, you'll notice that we are taking our time going through it, because what we're about to experience in John 11 is actually one of the most important things to understand as we prepare for the rest of John. There are two really important things going on here. Number one, we've got the only place in the Bible where we actually see God cry. That's important. It's important to understand why he was crying. What makes God cry? Well, we're going to come up to that, but I don't want to rush up to that. I want us to really grasp what's happening in this whole situation. And the second thing we see is obviously a resurrection. But the timing of this resurrection of Lazarus, I believe, is also extremely important. And so that's why I don't want to, again, just rush through this. I think that we really need to comprehend what's going on. So as we talk about this, we've kind of gotten a feel for the family, for Lazarus and for Martha and for Mary, the relationship that's going on there. We've talked that through. We've kind of understood Jesus' relationship to those three people. And so that helps us to understand a little bit of what's going on. And now Jesus is about to make some amazing statements. He's going to talk about death. And it's something that we need to understand. When Jesus talks about death, is it the same thing that we mean when we talk about death? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Let me read you some quotes by some Christian theologians on death. The first one is by Gresham McKean, and it says, "Life, according to the Bible, is not just existence, but it is existence in the presence and with the favor of God. And death is not just the death of the body, but it is separation from God, and a doom that should fill the heart of man with a nameless dread." That's deep, isn't it? Helps you understand what life and death is. Look at this one by Peter Misselbrook. "Death is not part of the natural process. It is the judgment of God on sin." Let that sink in a little bit. We say death comes to everybody, and that is true. But it's not because it's natural. It wasn't the way it was meant to be. It's because all of us deserve the wages of sin. That's why death happens to everyone. Look at this one by John Murray. "Man is not naturally mortal. Death is not the debt of nature. It is the wages of sin." And of course, Charles Ryrie said, "Death is not extinction in any uses of the word. It is always separation." There is so much mystery that surrounds death. It could be said that the meaning of death is more important to understand than the meaning of life. Let that sink in for a minute. I got one more quote, and this is a really good one. You'll like this one. If the meaning of life is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, then I believe the meaning of death is exactly the same. And look, you said that. Now let that one sink in. While I have a cup of coffee. You know, one of the main reasons we cannot fully understand death is that no one has ever experienced it completely and lived to tell the story. That's why none of us fully understand except one person, Jesus Christ himself. So surely, if we're going to understand something, we should take it from the point of view of somebody who has actually experienced it and lived to tell the story. So let's consider the words of Jesus. Even in our passage in John 11, Lazarus will go through the death experience. But I find it interesting that the most obvious questions, all the ones that we would like to ask, aren't asked and answered in the passage. What was it like, Lazarus? Did you see a great light? Did you go towards the light? Was it peaceful? Was it quiet? Were there angels? None of that is answered, is it? Or even asked. John 11 is primarily about death, life, and the relationship between these two things. And what those two things have to do with Jesus. So let's be prepared to be challenged. Let's talk about something that honestly isn't very nice to talk about. Most of us don't or won't. A lot of people just want to pretend it's not going to happen. But it is. And it might be sooner to us than we imagined. I have a very, very good friend in America. He was my boss for many years at a place where I worked in America. And he's a believer, and he was a good friend to me. And over the last 2 days, he had open heart surgery. And he survived. He's doing well. He's breathing on his own. I think he's about 15 years older than I am. Maybe 20 years older. He's in between me and Dad. So probably not 20 years, because you're only 21 years older than me. So, cool, I'm getting old. But the point is, leading up to that, his family was very focused on, guess what? The possibility that death might be imminent for him. They were asking for prayers, and they were saying, let's keep Kenny in our thoughts and in our prayers, because he might not see Monday. But the simple truth is, all of us are in the same boat. We might not see Monday. And we don't want to think about that, do we? That's not nice to talk about. But the simple truth is, it's a fact. So I want to try and answer 4 questions from our passage this morning. Number 1, what does Jesus mean by saying that something leads to death? What does Jesus mean by saying that something leads to death? Number 2, what is Jesus' perspective on death? Number 3, what does death and life have to do with believing? And number 4, why is it so hard for mortals to believe the same thing about death that Jesus does? Oh, thanks. I had those written down. They're even in red. I should have known. So those are the questions we're going to try and answer this morning. We're going to start with question number 2. These questions are answered in order of the text. But I believe in order to understand the other 3 better, we need to jump to number 2 and answer that question first. So the first question we're going to answer is, what is Jesus' perspective on death? And it's found in verses 11 to 14. He's talking to his disciples. They're not in Bethany yet. They're some distance off. Word has arrived that Lazarus is ill. He's obviously not just got a cold. But word has arrived he's very ill. In fact, it would be great if you could get here as quick as you can, because you might not get to see him again. Possibly you might even be able to do something for him, but nobody else seems to be able to. That's the idea of the message that has arrived to Jesus. So Jesus is having this discussion with his disciples, and he says, after saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." Well, that's good news, isn't it? The disciples said to him, "Well, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he'll recover." Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. So there's 2 terms that are going on here, aren't there? Death and falling asleep. Jesus uses both terms. Does he use them interchangeably? Does he mean the same thing by them? Well, let's see what the Bible teaches us about these 2 terms. First of all, there is a difference in Jesus' view between death and falling asleep. All right? So what does he mean by falling asleep? It's a term we only find in the New Testament. It's not an Old Testament term. Jews had very different views on death. They had different ideas about what happened afterward. God didn't talk a lot to them about life after death. And so there were a lot of different views. You even see them in the New Testament, don't you? You see people arguing, scholars of the Old Testament arguing with each other about whether or not there was a resurrection. A lot of Jews believed in reincarnation. that the soul would move from one physical body to another physical body. And that came from some of the prophecies. That, for instance, Elijah had to come before the Messiah would come. So it was the idea that a physical or the soul of Elijah would reappear in another physical body before the Messiah came. So these ideas were actually quite common amongst the Jews, and still are today amongst Orthodox Jews, the idea of reincarnation. In fact, there are a lot of religions in the world that believe in reincarnation. It appears that Judaism was one of the first. Many believe that there was nothing after this life, and this was all there was. And so any rewards that you would get for being good or godly would have to come in this life, which then obviously led to the teaching that if good things were happening to you, it's because you had been good to God. And if bad things are happening to you, it's because you're now getting your reward for being bad. And that wasn't something that was reserved for afterlife, because there was no afterlife in many of their opinions. Some believed in the resurrection. The Pharisees did. I believe David did in the Old Testament. I believe Solomon did. There were some that did, in fact, believe in a resurrection. We could certainly say Abraham did, because the book of Hebrews, I believe, teaches us that Abraham believed in the resurrection. Listen to some of the New Testament terms for falling asleep. In Matthew 27, it says, the tombs, this is after Jesus' death on the cross, the tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. See the term used there? We understand what's going on, don't we? There is a resurrection happening there. Soul and body has been reunited. And so the term falling asleep is used. In 1 Corinthians 15, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, that's Jesus, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And so there's the contrast to help us understand what fallen asleep means. You're either alive or you're fallen asleep, at least if you're in Christ. Later on in the chapter he says, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we see, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. So there's the idea that you're either alive here on earth, or you have fallen asleep, and therefore you're in heaven. And you're waiting to come back with the Lord. We might say that being asleep is the way that God describes a person who has separated from his physical present body. And that's why it is described this way, because it is only a temporary situation. Just like sleep is a temporary situation. You're going to wake up. If you don't wake up from sleep, you're not asleep. You've got other problems. If you're asleep, you're going to wake up. And that's how God views a believer who dies. This is just a temporary situation. It's not permanent. So what's the difference between that and death? Well, let's go way back to Genesis chapter 2. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. The life he breathed in, I believe, was his soul, his spirit. It's his life. God breathed into Adam what would become his life. And then God says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So we see life and we see death in just a few verses. God told Adam that if he ate a particular tree, then he would experience both good and evil. Up to that point, he has experienced good. He's had the life of God breathed into him. He fellowships on a regular basis with God. He knows what good is, but he has no idea. He's never experienced evil. If he eats of this particular fruit, he will, on that day, experience good and evil. I don't believe that there was anything necessarily special about that tree. It could have been one of many trees that all looked the same. But God was setting for Adam the ability to choose to obey and enjoy life and never to experience evil, or to disobey and to, in that day, die. That was his choice. There was nothing magical about the fruit, I don't believe. I could be wrong, and I'm okay to be wrong on that. That's not the point. The point is, Adam has to make a choice. How would he experience evil? By eating of a particular tree. He would have disobeyed God. He would know evil. And on that day, something would happen. On that day. Now, if we believe that the 6 days from previously are actually days, then we have to also accept that this is also a day. We can't pick and choose how we define words. And I believe on that day, Adam died. Because death to God is separation. On that day, he disobeyed God. He experienced now what evil is, and his relationship with God died. He was separated from God on that day. And it broke God's heart. Then pay attention. It always happens on the most dramatic moments, doesn't it? Just spoils everything. All right, we'll drink some coffee and start again. Just imagine, though, because God was not aware, first of all, of what Adam was going to do, because he had already prepared a plan of salvation. But he also, I believe, was not unaware as Adam and Eve walked towards that tree. And can you imagine the heartache? I believe that the emotions that were going on there were reminiscent of John chapter 11 and verse 35, where it says Jesus wept. I believe that those were the sort of things that God experienced as he saw his beautiful creation, whom he had breathed his own spirit into, so that that person could live, approaching the tree, knowing everything that I just made is about to die. And it helps you to understand why God hates sin so much. Because it destroys and it kills and it separates. It never unites and brings life. It was separation of Adam's perfect and sinless soul from God's fellowship. And the relationship between Adam and God died on the day he ate of that tree. But you know, there's another passage in the Old Testament, in 1 Kings chapter 17, that helps us to understand a little bit more about this concept. And this is about Elijah and a widow woman and her son. And it says he stretched himself upon the child because the child has died. Now, some commentators, unfortunately, believe that the child was just really ill. I don't. I believe he was dead. And it says, and he cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." That's why I believe that he wasn't just really ill. And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again. And he revived, And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." Now, why do I bring this passage up? I bring this up because it shows us that there's life inside of somebody that can come out of them. What we see is what's left behind. We call that death. God calls it separation. God calls it falling asleep. And that life that has been taken out of that body can, under certain circumstances, be put back in. We see it. But it has to be a supernatural process. That doesn't happen naturally, and it doesn't happen normally, and it doesn't happen very often. And it only happens if God's going to get the glory for it. This child's life is described as something that had left and returned. The idea is that life that we see in our English Bible is the Hebrew word nephesh, that means soul or spirit. This word is actually used to describe life in anything that breathes. So it's not just people, but it's also animals. So it's the life force that is in them. It can separate from the body, but sometimes it can be reunited. You see, to God, the death that we understand is separation. And God says that the spirit, the soul, the real us that separates from a body lives forever. Now, where do I get that from? Well, 1 Corinthians 15 teaches us about believers. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on the immortality. Why? Because at some point, the soul, the spirit, the real us that has separated from the body will be reunited. And so this body that is left behind has to change in order to be able to live with the real us, the soul, the spirit, that never dies. So this has to change in some way in order to accept that. So the spirit that is separated will always live. But I believe the Bible also teaches that the soul, the spirit of unbelievers will also live forever. Ecclesiastes 12:7 says, "And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." And he's not just talking about believers there. God created man to live forever. When I say man, I mean mankind. I mean men and women were created to live forever. This body is the one that receives the wages of sin. The soul, the spirit, the life that is breathed into us then has to deal with what we did in this body before it was separated. To God, there are two parts to every person, the material and the immaterial. They are both just as real as each other. And every person who is honest with themselves understands that. They know that there is more to them than just, how did C.S. Lewis put it? Atoms bouncing around inside a skull. Because that's what humanists would have you believe, or materialists would have you believe. But we all know there's more to it than that. That's how we come up with right and wrong, with morality, with choices. That's how we come up with reasoning and understanding. These two parts are called physical, spiritual, material, immaterial, body, soul, and spirit, however you want to describe it. That's how God sees us. One is temporary. And thanks to Adam's sin, all humanity is now separated from God's fellowship. But the other is still permanent. And death is what separates those two parts. Death is what keeps the physical here and allows the spirit to enter eternity. Death is the wages or the just dues for sin. It's why this physical body has to be left behind. Because of sin, at death or separation, the spirit still continues. But now, and here's important for you to understand, but now it will also be separated from God unless God does something supernatural to remedy that awful situation. So the spirit once it leaves this body, is still separated from God. Because in the day that Adam ate, he was separated, and everybody who came after him was also separated from the fellowship of God. That's the bad news. That's why death is so awful. You know, we read that passage about, and I was thinking about this morning. I wasn't sure where to fit it in. I'll stick it in here. Maybe we'll make this a two-part series. I don't know. I was thinking about how Paul tells us that as believers, we don't mourn as others do. But we still mourn. Because death is separation. Do you ever feel sad when you hear about a really close friend who you love to spend time with? Do you ever feel sad when you hear that they're about to go on holiday? Yeah? Oh, what am I going to do for coffee? I won't be able to talk to you, and I'm going to miss our times together. And you feel sad. Why? Are you sad because they're going to go off and have a nice time? You're sad because you're going to be separated, right? Or how about a really close friend that you find has had a promotion at work, but it means they have to move away? Are you sad because something good has happened to them? No, you love the fact that something good has happened. You're sad that you're now going to be separated. That's how we are as believers. Something amazing and great has happened. They've been promoted to glory. They will now experience the eternal rest that God promises. They will get what all of us want. But we're still sad because we're going to be separated from them, aren't we? And that is sad. We don't mourn like others who have no hope, but we still mourn, and that's okay. But we need to understand, and we're not going to go any further than that this morning. I'm not going to cover the rest of the passage this morning, which actually works out well. It means I can put in a lot of time helping on the building. I don't have to get a sermon ready for next week. But no, seriously though, we need to seriously understand what it is that God truly means when he talks about death and separation and falling asleep. And when he's talking to his disciples, you can imagine some of them have been taught about reincarnation. Some of them have been taught that there's no life after death. And so when Jesus says, well, Lazarus has just fallen asleep, their only thought is, well, he'll wake up. And in Jesus' mind, they're absolutely right. He will wake up. He will wake up. But what does this mean about believing? What does it mean about death in God's mind? And why is it so hard for us to understand that? Well, you come back next week and we're going to talk more about that. I believe that as we talk about this, it can promote in us sometimes hopelessness. Death sometimes promotes hopelessness. And in this day and age, with all the things that are going on in our world right now, it's hard to find glimmers of hope. Any hope at all. If you put your hope in any politician over the last 2 or 3 years, you've probably been sorely disappointed. Because even the ones that believe in the same sort of ideals as we do, they're not exactly bastions of morality, are they? And they've let us down time and time again. If you put your hope in your job, the last couple of years have probably kind of shook that a little bit. If you put your hope in money in the bank, or in the fact that there's always going to be toilet paper on the shelves, everything that we thought we had hope in has been shaken. And certainly talking about death doesn't necessarily help that. But I hope you come back for the rest of the story. We're going to watch a really short video, and it's about the class that we're going to be having during Bethel Steps starting on the 6th of February. And if this is something you'd be interested in going to, let us know. If you're online and watching this, please let us know, and we will get you the details for it. And as soon as this is over, Matt's going to come and lead us in some songs.